Jimmy Stewart was about to confess to murder. Not the kind that makes headlines or fills courtrooms, but the kind that eats a man alive for 37 years. He sat alone at table 7, staring at a yellowed envelope that contained the last words of a dead man, words that would have saved 2 lives if Jimmy hadn't thrown them away like garbage. Marie didn't know she was serving coffee to a killer. Marie had worked at Mel's Diner since 1962. She'd seen every kind of customer you could imagine. The truckers passing through on Route 66, the young couples sharing milkshakes, the salesmen nursing hangovers with black coffee and aspirin. But Jimmy Stewart was different. He wasn't just another customer. He was Jimmy Stewart, the man who'd made America fall in love with Bedford Falls, the man who'd talked to an angel and saved a savings and loan. But sitting there in that worn vinyl booth, stirring his coffee like he was trying to make sense of his troubles, he looked smaller somehow, older, like he was carrying a heavy weight on his shoulders. "More coffee, Mr. Stewart?" Marie asked, her voice trembling slightly with nervousness. She'd served him a dozen times before over the years, but it never got any easier. Jimmy looked up, and for just a moment, Marie saw something in his eyes that made her heart skip. It wasn't just sadness. It was something deeper, something that had been eating at him for years. "No thank you, Marie," he said in that familiar voice that had whispered sweet nothings to Grace Kelly and argued with Donna Reed about mortgage payments during happier times. "I'm still working on this one." Marie retreated to the coffee station, but she kept watching. She always watched on October 15th because October 15th was different. On October 15th, he waited. The diner was nearly empty at this hour. Just Jimmy, an old-timer named Harold reading yesterday's newspaper, and a trucker named Big Pete working through a stack of pancakes that could feed a small family. The late afternoon sun slanted through the windows, casting long shadows across the checkered floor. Outside, Los Angeles hummed with its usual chaos and noise, but inside Mel's Diner, time moved like honey on a cold day. Jimmy glanced at his watch nervously. He'd been sitting there for 2 hours and 13 minutes already. In another hour, maybe 2 at most, he'd leave the same way he always left. He'd place a crisp $20 bill on the table, enough to cover the coffee and pie 3 times over, and walk out to his Mercury in the parking lot. He'd drive home to his house in Beverly Hills, pour himself a glass of cold milk, and sit in his favorite chair reading scripts he'd never accept. But for now, he waited. The bell above the door chimed, and Jimmy's head snapped up with desperate hope. A young woman in a nurse's uniform walked in, ordered coffee to go, and left without glancing in his direction. Jimmy's shoulders sagged slightly, and he went back to stirring his coffee. This was the part that broke Marie's heart every year. The hoping, the way Jimmy's face would light up just a fraction every time the bell chimed, and the way it would dim when it wasn't whoever he was waiting for. Harold folded his newspaper and walked over to Jimmy's table. At 73, Harold had earned the right to talk to anybody he pleased, famous or not. "Mind if I sit down, Jimmy?" Harold asked, already sliding into the booth before Jimmy could answer. "Been watching you sit here alone for the better part of 3 hours, and it's starting to make me nervous." Jimmy managed a small smile. "Free country, Harold." "That it is," Harold said, signaling Marie for coffee. "Question is, what's a man like you doing sitting in a place like this on a beautiful Tuesday afternoon? Shouldn't you be off making movies or kissing pretty actresses?" "Haven't made a picture in 2 years, Jimmy said, finally setting down his spoon. "And I'm too old to be kissing anybody but my wife." "Gloria's a lucky woman," Harold said, accepting his cup from Marie. "So why aren't you home with her instead of wearing a hole in that coffee cup?" Jimmy was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was so soft that Harold had to lean in to hear him. "Some days, Harold, a man's got to sit with his ghosts." But the ghost Jimmy Stewart was waiting for wasn't what anyone could have imagined. The truth behind those October 15th visits would shake how America saw its most beloved everyman. Harold studied Jimmy's face. He'd fought in World War I, buried 2 wives, and raised 4 children. He knew the look of a man carrying something heavy. "This about the war?" Harold asked quietly. Jimmy shook his head. "This is about something that happened long before the war, Harold. Something I should have done but didn't. Something I've been trying to make right for 37 years. 37 years. That would take them back to 1926, when Jimmy was still trying to make it on Broadway. 37 years is a long time to carry anything," Harold said. "Some things don't get lighter with time," Jimmy replied. "Some things just get heavier." Marie glanced at Jimmy's watch. 4:15 p.m. She'd been working at Mel's long enough to know that Jimmy would stay until exactly 6 p.m., then leave. He never stayed past 6. "Mr. Stewart," she said, approaching with fresh coffee, "I don't mean to pry, but I've been working here for 23 years, and you're the most punctual customer we've ever had. Same day, same time, same table. What makes October 15th so special?" Jimmy looked up with eyes that seemed older than his 65 years. For a moment Marie thought he might actually answer her. "October 15th, Jimmy said slowly, "is the anniversary of the biggest mistake I ever made." Marie's coffee pot trembled. She'd expected some Hollywood answer about visiting an old friend. She hadn't expected raw honesty. "Maybe it's time somebody knew," Jimmy said, his voice gaining strength. Harold leaned forward. Big Pete had stopped eating and was pretending not to listen. There was something about Jimmy Stewart's voice that commanded attention. "It was 1926, Jimmy began. "I was 23 years old and dumber than a box of rocks. I'd just gotten to New York with $37 and a head full of Broadway dreams. I was sharing a room with a guy named Tommy Brennan." Jimmy paused to sip his coffee, his hands shaking slightly. Tommy was from Chicago, Irish kid about my age, with bright red hair and a laugh that could fill up a room. He'd come to New York to be a writer, had a notebook full of stories and dreams, and every night he'd read them while I practiced my lines. We were both broke, both hungry, and both convinced we were going to set the world on fire. The diner had grown completely quiet. Jimmy's voice had taken on the quality of a confessor. Tommy had a girl back in Chicago, Mary O'Brien. He carried her picture and wrote her letters every day. He was going to make it as a writer, then send for her. They were going to get married and live in a nice place uptown. Jimmy's voice caught, but he pushed through. Tommy was good, really good. He could write stories that made you feel things, but New York publishers kept saying no, said his writing was too old-fashioned. Wait until you hear what Jimmy did next, because what happened that October evening would haunt him for the rest of his life. October 15th, 1926, Jimmy continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'd just gotten my first real break. A casting director had seen me in a small production and offered me a part in a Broadway show. Nothing big, just a supporting role, but it came with real money, enough to get a decent apartment, buy some clothes, maybe even take a girl to dinner." Harold was leaning forward now, completely absorbed. Marie had forgotten about refilling coffee cups, her attention riveted on Jimmy's every word. "I came back to the boarding house that night with a bottle of cheap champagne and a head full of grand plans. Tommy was sitting on his bed, reading a letter. I could tell from his face that something was terribly wrong. The letter was from Mary. Her father was sick, real sick, and the family was struggling to pay for his medicine. She needed Tommy to come home immediately." Jimmy stopped talking and stared out the window at the parking lot where a young mother was loading groceries into her car trunk with her toddler watching. The simple, everyday normalcy of the scene seemed to pain him deeply. Tommy was torn apart, Jimmy said, and for the first time real pain cracked through his voice. He'd been in New York for 8 months, finally making connections, but Mary needed him. The silence in the diner was complete. "He asked me what he should do," Jimmy said, his voice breaking. "Sitting on that mattress, holding her letter, he asked me what he should do." Jimmy's hands started shaking. "And I looked at my best friend and lied to his face." Mary felt her chest tighten.
"I told him to stay," Jimmy said, each word cutting him. "I told him Mary would understand, that love meant supporting each other's dreams. I convinced him that going back would end both their dreams." Jimmy's knuckles turned white, gripping his coffee cup. "I believed what I was telling him," Jimmy said. "At least I thought I did. But the truth was, I was terrified, scared that if Tommy left, I'd be alone in that room with nothing but my cowardice. What Jimmy Stewart did next would destroy 2 lives and haunt him for 37 years. Tommy decided to stay," Jimmy continued. "He wrote Mary explaining he couldn't come home yet, that he was on the verge of a breakthrough. He asked me to mail it on my way to rehearsal." Jimmy's hands were trembling. "I took the letter," he said. "I walked to the post office, bought a stamp and stood in front of the mailbox for 20 minutes, and then I walked away. I threw Tommy's letter in a trash can and never said a word." Marie gasped audibly. Harold's face had gone pale. "Why?" Harold asked hoarsely. "Because I was 23 and terrified of being alone," Jimmy said. "Because I was a coward who convinced himself he was being noble, but that wasn't the end. What happened next would prove that some sins echo through generations." 3 weeks later, Tommy received a telegram. Mary O'Brien had died of pneumonia. She'd been working double shifts to pay for her father's medicine, and exhaustion had compromised her immune system. The telegram came on a Tuesday morning, Jimmy said, barely whispering. "I was at rehearsal when it arrived. When I got back, I found Tommy sitting on his bed, still holding the yellow paper. He'd been crying for hours." Jimmy paused for a shaky breath.
He kept saying she must have thought he didn't care, that she'd died thinking he'd abandoned her. He kept reading her last letter, where she'd begged him to come home, and all I could do was stand there, knowing I'd stolen his chance to be with her. The weight of 37 years was visible on Jimmy's shoulders. Tommy left for Chicago the next morning, Jimmy continued. He packed everything into a single suitcase. Before he left, he gave me his boarding house address in Chicago. He made me promise to write, to stay in touch. Did you? Harold asked, knowing the answer. I wrote him once, Jimmy said, his voice barely audible now, a month after he left New York for good. I told him about the play, about my first good reviews in the newspapers, about all the opportunities that were starting to open up for me in the theater. I asked about his writing, about his family back in Chicago, about how he was handling losing Mary. I mailed that letter with genuine hope in my heart, and waited for a response that never came. Jimmy picked up his coffee cup with hands that were shaking badly. 6 months later, I wrote to the boarding house in Chicago where he was supposed to be staying. The landlord wrote back and told me that Tommy had never actually arrived there. He'd bought a train ticket to Chicago, but he'd never made it home to his family. The police found his body in the Chicago River 3 days after he was supposed to arrive. Suicide, they said. Left a note saying he couldn't live with the pain of losing her. The silence was deafening. Marie was crying. Harold stared at his coffee. That letter I never mailed, Jimmy said, his voice breaking completely. It might not have saved her life, but it would have let her know Tommy loved her more than anything. It would have given her comfort, and it might have saved Tommy's life too. Now you'll understand why Jimmy Stewart never missed a single October 15th. So why here? Marie asked gently. Why this table, this day? Jimmy looked around the diner. Because this is where I was supposed to meet his sister, Jimmy said. October 15, 1963. I'd found her address through a private investigator. I'd finally worked up courage to tell her the truth, to apologize. I wrote her a letter and asked if she would meet me here. Did she come? Harold asked. Jimmy shook his head. She wrote back and said she couldn't, said knowing the truth wouldn't bring back her brother or Mary. But she said something else. She said if I really wanted to honor Tommy's memory, I should come here every year on October 15th and sit at this table until someone needed to hear Tommy's story. This transformed everything. This wasn't just about guilt. This was about purpose. She said Tommy always believed stories had power, Jimmy continued, that the right story told to the right person at the right time could change everything. She said if I sat here long enough, eventually someone would need to hear about speaking truth when it matters, about the cost of cowardice, about love letters that should never go unsent. Marie was crying openly now. For 37 years, Jimmy said, I've come here waiting for that person, waiting for someone who needs to hear Tommy's story. Someone standing at their own mailbox, holding their own letter, trying to decide whether to be brave or be safe. He looked around the table and smiled for the first time. I think, he said quietly, I may have finally found them. Marie thought about letters she'd never written to her estranged sister. Harold thought about the apology he'd never given his late wife. Big Pete thought about the phone call he'd been avoiding. Every year for 12 years, Jimmy said, standing slowly, I've left money on this table and walked away, feeling like I'd failed again. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a yellowed envelope, creased from years of handling. But what Jimmy Stewart was about to reveal would change everything these people thought they knew about guilt and forgiveness. This is Tommy's last letter to Mary, Jimmy said, placing it on the table. The one I never mailed. I've carried it every day for 37 years, hoping to find someone brave enough to learn from my cowardice. Mary stared at the envelope like it was sacred. But today, Jimmy continued, I realize the story isn't about the letter I didn't send. It's about the letters that still can be sent. It's about words that still can be spoken. It's about courage that can still be found even when you think it's too late. He placed a $20 bill beside the letter. Tommy Brennan was a better man than I was, Jimmy said, his voice heavy with years of regret. He loved completely, dreamed bravely, and died believing the person he loved most had forgotten him. I can't bring him back, and I can't undo what I did, but maybe his story can help someone else choose courage over the comfort of lies. Jimmy Stewart looked around the diner one last time. The letters you're carrying, he said softly, the words you're afraid to speak, the apologies you think it's too late to make. Don't let them die with you. Don't let someone else spend 37 years wondering what might have been different if they'd just been brave enough to tell the truth. And with that, Jimmy Stewart walked out of Mel's diner for the last time in his life. He died 6 months later, on a quiet summer morning, but his secret died in that diner on October 15, 1963. And Tommy Brennan's story lived on in the hearts of everyone who heard it that day. Marie kept Tommy's letter carefully preserved.
She framed it and hung it beside the cash register with a small brass placard that read, "In loving memory of Tommy Brennan and Mary O'Brien, and in honor of the words we're brave enough to say." Harold went straight home that night and wrote a long letter to his late wife's grave. Big Pete called his estranged son the next morning and said, "I'm sorry for the first time in 3 long years." And every October 15th since then, Mel's Diner keeps table 7 completely empty from 3 to 6 p.m., with a small wooden sign that reads, "Reserved for anyone brave enough to tell their truth," because sometimes the most powerful stories aren't about heroes who save the day. Sometimes they're about ordinary people who learn that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's doing what's right despite the fear. And sometimes we get to hear those stories before it's too late to write our own meaningful ending. What letters are sitting unmailed in your own life right now? What important words are you afraid to speak because you think it's too late? I want you to think about that right now. Who do you owe an apology to? What truth have you been too scared to tell? Jimmy Stewart carried his secret for 37 long years until it was too late. Don't let that be your story. Pick up the phone, write that letter, say those words, before it's too late. Hit that like button if this touched your heart, and subscribe for more stories that matter. See you next time.